Happy, happy snow day, everybody. We are going to pick up our lecture on the seed plants with the gymnosperm life cycle. We talked through this at the end of last class. We got talking through this diagram, and I said we would start today with a video to talk through it with a different voice and a different person in navigating you through the story of gymnosperms using the pine tree as an example.
Gymnosperms are seed plants that have no enclosed chambers around their seeds. Most gymnosperms are conifers, cone-bearing trees such as the pine shown here. The male and female parts of a conifer are found in separate locations and structures on the tree. A pine tree represents the diploid sporophyte phase of the life cycle. Haploid male and female gametophytes develop in cones on adult sporophytes. Gametophytes produce eggs and sperm. Pollination brings gametophytes together, and an egg is fertilized. The fertilized egg develops into an embryo, protected and nourished within a seed. The seed germinates and grows into an adult sporophyte, completing the pine life cycle.
Things you want to keep in mind are that, again, we have sporophyte dominant plants. That has been true since we got to vascular plants. Only our moss are bryophytes, consisting of those hornworts, the moss itself, and this spike. No? Forgetting my other one offhand, but not going to worry about it. Everything else, once we get to vasculature, the mature plant that we're used to seeing when we think of that plant is going to be your sporophyte, your spore producing generation. In this case, they make their cones. Their cones are modified spore producing leaves. Each one of those scales of the cone makes spores. Those spores will not be released. They will stay as spores and develop into gametophytes, male or female versions, within the cone itself. The male gametophyte will develop into pollen and be released on the wind. The female gametophyte will stay, get larger, produce an egg, and wait for pollination and the subsequent fertilization to occur. Once the seed develops, which can take years in many of these gymnosperms, they get released, carried by the wind, and land somewhere far away from the parent. Everything is wind, pollinated, wind, distributed seeds. That is key. That is a big difference we're going to see as we get into the flowering and fruiting plants later in today's lecture. I got a couple videos just so you can see this wind, wind pollination, and wind seed dispersal. This first one is the male cone. In this, you're seeing the pollen, a gust of wind, and the pollen blowing right out of it. I think they slow it down in a couple of these shots, yeah. Remember, the pollen is the male gametophyte with the sperm inside of it, but so teeny tiny, and with those little Mickey Mouse-like ears to capture the wind so that they can easily be carried just on air currents away from that male cone that you see there. If you live in an area that has a lot of pine trees and conifers, you will notice at a certain time of year that your car just turns yellow. That's actually pine pollen, or at least conifer pollen, rather than pollen from flowering plants. Because the pollen is purely dependent on the wind, to distribute it, they make so much pollen because it's not targeted, right? The wind is not going to guarantee that that pollen makes it to a female cone of the same species. So they make a lot of pollen in order to counter the randomness of the wind. And next one, we'll see some time lapse of female cones. This first one is a cone I have never seen before. I do not know what kind of cone this is. Almost looks like bird mouths opening. The rest of them are more cones we're familiar with. And this is time-lapsed, so the seeds look like they're zooming away, but if you do look closely, you will see the little seeds with their wings start to fly off. Unlike the last video where they slowed it down, this one is sped up, so you can see the cones opening. These are cones that actually open with fire. They are a kind of pine tree, and at the moment I'm forgetting them. They're very big in Colorado, where I was for about 10 years. Oh, what the heck's their name? Ponderosa pine, pretty sure. They only open in fire, so we actually need fire to perpetuate the life cycle of these trees. They don't open on their own. That fire is necessary. Nifty evolutionary adaptation. So earlier, that video walked you through the life cycle. Yesterday, I walked you through the life cycle. Feel free to use that image of the life cycle, which you actually have from lab as well. So you can use that life cycle diagram and these slides, which present a script to walk you through the whole thing. So all of these slides match up to the diagram, the pine life cycle. Take a moment, pause your video here to write out some answers. Try not to use your notes first, and then look back on your notes and see what you can add to your answers. First, outline the structure and development of gymnosperm reproductive organs, those cones, and analyze how wind influences their reproductive success and survival. Make sure you're covering pollination and seed dispersal. Pause here and then resume. I hope you did pause and try those questions, filling in your notes and any gaps. Off to next. Let's look at ecological roles first of our gymnosperms, and then we'll look at some economic roles. Forest structure, these evergreen trees, especially our conifers, the majority of the gymnosperms, certainly in our ecosystems that we have here in the United States, form backbone of many ecosystems. They are a year-round source of growth and carbon cycling within the forests they take part in, unlike our deciduous trees that lose their leaves and they will be consuming oxygen and giving off CO2 all winter long. These aspects of it will be doing the reverse even in the winter. Sun is not as intense in our winters, so they do not photosynthesize nearly as much as they do in the summer, so they do slow down in the winter, but still there. Certainly all plants that are growing are going to contribute to soil stabilization, and these will help contribute to that soil stabilization in environments that are not as friendly for other stabilizers like grasses and other very fibrous root system type plants that would not necessarily thrive in the environments that these needle-bearing, highly modified for cold and dry condition needles are able to thrive. Economically, massive source of timber. Yes, there are plenty of angiosperm timbers that we use, but a lot of our timber comes from pine. A good number, and especially on the not as expensive, not as worthy of artistic finish woods, are pine. So if you haven't done any wood projects, you probably will at some point in your life, and you will notice that the pine lumber in Home Depot or Lowe's or Menards, whatever your place of purchase is, are pine. The other one you'll probably see on the cheaper end of things is poplar, which is a flowering plant. Paper manufacturing, definitely huge source of the ground up wood pulp that will be reconstituted as paper. Plenty of other things are extracted from these trees. Often the pulp, the wood, is destined for the timber or the paper industry, and then other things can be extracted from the parts of the tree that do not get used in lumber and paper manufacturing, extracting different resins from usually the sap portion that doesn't go into the above mentioned products that can be used. One of the popular older ones is for varnishes, the way we got some of the finishing shiny product that can be put on wood. But adhesives and plenty of other things could be found in there. Things we don't even know we need yet might be found in there. Quick section. Take a moment, evaluate the role of gymnosperms in ecosystems and in economic, ecological significance and economic significance. Pause here. 3, 2, 1. Resuming, hoping you paused and tried those questions. All right. Switching over, we are now venturing into the angiosperms. So these are flowering and fruiting plants. Angiosperms are seed plants, just like our gymnosperms. Yes, they had seeds too. There was the huge evolutionary adaptation that came with the gymnosperms. The angiosperms have evolutionary adaptations beyond just having seeds. They produce flowers to help encourage specific pollination via animals, usually. And they produce fruits that will wrap themselves around the seed so the seed does not go out into the environment naked, like we call the naked seed plants of the gymnosperms. Just like gymnosperms and our vascular seedless plants, they have their vascular tissue, and just like the gymnosperms, they have the seeds. So we continue to see this hierarchy of early adaptations that were really good, like vascular tissues, get inherited down the seedless vascular plant route and all the seed plant route. And then when the seed came around, that was so beneficial that the gymnosperms had it, but the angiosperms inherited it as well. So continue this descent with modification idea where common ancestors, these branching points, offer a way to see who came from who and what traits might have evolved at those branching points or right before the branching points that would be carried forward. What are flowers? Flowers are actually modified leaves. They are part of angiosperm sexual reproduction life cycle stages. They form on the sporophytes, those spore-producing plants, and they will form at a terminal end of a stem. They can't grow past the flower. They modify those leaves into different organs with the goal of making pollen, attracting a pollinator to release it, maybe, probably, or adapted for wind pollination, just like our gymnosperms. And then also to make the female gametophyte to make its egg and stay within the ovary of the flower, waiting for pollination to occur. If it is a flashy flower a flower a 5-year-old would know is a flower, right? It's colorful, it has big, colorful petals. To repeat myself on colorful, you may or may not notice the reproductive organs beyond those, the male or female stamen and carpels, but if you see those bright petals, then it is almost definitely going to be animal pollinated. That color is meant to attract specific pollinators, guide them in, trick them into getting a little pollen on them, maybe offering them a little nectar to entice them in, as well as the color itself. And any pollen that they already got stuck on them will hopefully stick to the stigma of the carpel, so that it can get down into the ovules within the ovaries to fertilize the egg. However, many are wind pollinated still. This happens most frequently when you notice angiosperms that grow in dense populations, side by side, packed in. So you can see here I've got my picture of grass. Grass is an angiosperm, and those are flowers that you see there, but they're not flashy. They don't look special. That is because they're not a flower that is meant to be pollinated by an animal. So there's no reason to invest the energy in a flashy flower for attracting. There's no reason to invest in energy for nectar, sugar, in order to attract a pollinator. They are boring, but they still make the male gametophyte in there. The male gametophyte becomes pollen, and instead of being carried on an animal, they just get picked up into the wind, just like the gymnosperms we saw. Fruits will be a further development of the flower. So we had our tomato flower on the left here. It releases its pollen, hopefully on that bee right there, and hopefully that bee brought over the pollen. Pollen landed on the stigma. Pollen tube grew down the style into the ovule, and the nuclei of that pollen got transferred over to the egg. The egg nuclei and the sperm nuclei fused, making our zygote, developing into the embryo. Well, great. That was pollination followed by fertilization. If fertilization occurs, then a fruit will form. You can still see the stem of the flower and the sepals of the flower on top of our tomato here. And then the ovary, usually it could be another part of the flower, but typically, and for simplicity of this class, we're just going to stick with the ovary swells up and becomes a fruit. Often that fruit is nutrient rich, sweet, at the very least high in calories, in order to entice an animal to come get it. They'll have color indications when the fruit is ready. Usually they're not sweet until that color is ready, to make sure that animals don't come get the fruit before the seeds inside are mature enough to survive. And then you can see all of what were ovules inside the ovary have now become seeds. They're larger, and inside of each one of these tomato seeds is a new sporophyte tomato embryo. The beauty of most of these is those seeds are tough enough with their double integuments and other structures that the fruit will help provide to survive the the digestive system of the animal that eats them. And the animal will have it in their gut and carry it away from the parent plant, pooping it somewhere different. So it's not just sitting at the base of the parent plant. The parent plant does not want to compete with its offspring, so that would be beneficial to get an animal to carry it away. Here we revisit the seeds from, or we revisit grasses. Just like the flower of the grass was not very flashy, neither is the fruit of the grass. Yes, grass has fruit. It is not a word you are used to hearing, but botanically, from a botany perspective, these are fruits that you see here. And they're not flashy in color. They're not nutrient-rich exteriors. The seed is pretty nutrient-rich, but the fruit itself is not nutrient-rich. So we don't get a lot of animals coming to get these. And that's because they're wind dispersed. Why invest the energy in the color and nutrients of a fruit if all you need, because they can grow so close to their parents, is just a little bit of a structure to catch the wind? Angiosperm evolution is still a mystery. We do know that they originated about 140 million years ago. We know that they dominated the ecosystems about 100 million years ago. And that there was a huge diversification when there were some mass extinctions about 66 million years ago. Again, revisiting this radiant evolution or adaptive radiation, when a big opening in niches becomes available due to a mass extinction, you often see that adaptive radiation where tons of evolution occurs because plants or animals are now able to take advantage of resources they weren't able to before because another species was hogging them. And the traits that allow them success will be compounded upon over time. Geologic time. Biologic, well, not lifetime. Biologic time, probably more geologic time. I'll stick with that word. All right. Cool thing about angiosperms is because of the tight interplay between plants working with animals to get pollination to occur, fertilization to occur as a result of that pollination, and then to disperse those seeds inside the fruits, there is a lot of what we call coevolution. This idea that the flower or the plant with its flower and fruit will change, and the animal will change with it. The animal's goal is to get as much nutrients as possible. The flower's goal is to give as little nutrient as possible while still encouraging the animal to come, to make sure that if it gives away some nutrients, that the pollen will still go with the animal or the seed will still go with the fruit. So you see a lot of back and forth. The image I have here is a classic example. It's a flower that Darwin had noticed having this really long pollen tube that's kind of going parallel to the stem of the flower back here. And the nectar is way, 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 way at the bottom. The anthers for the pollen are right at the base of the flower. So he saw this flower and said, I bet there is an animal out there that has a tongue or something that can get all the way to the nectar at the bottom of this. Because the tricky thing that we think happened here was this moth had this really long proboscis. The straw-like thing is actually part of the moth, and it curls out like one of those like party blowers. And they're able to slurp up the nectar. But if they don't get close enough to get the pollen, then they are able to steal the calories without doing the work of pollination. They have no interest in pollinating, they just want the calories. But the plant doesn't want to give away the nutrients without the pollination. So it's this arms race of producing a longer pollen tube to make sure that the moth goes all the way in until it bumps the anthers and catches the pollen. And the moth saying, I guess I'm just better off if I have a longer proboscis. So the longer the proboscis, the more they were able to get the nectar. Back and forth, and you have this amazingly long pollen tube and this amazingly long proboscis on this moth as a result of many, 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 many generations of coevolution, both of them evolving together as a result of the tight, in this case, mutualistic relationship, symbiotic relationship between the two of them. They both gain something from this relationship if pollination is given along with the nectar. Lot of the evolution of the flower is all in relation to making sure that pollen goes. Pollen being carried in sticks to the stigma. Pollen being produced gets stuck to the animal. This is constant and ever-changing. That's why we have such a variety of different plants, or a bunch of different flowers on plants out there, to make sure that both of those things happen. Carry away the pollen and drop off pollen from other animals. There are ways the flowers can make sure that the animal is positioned just right when it's taking up the nectar to get the pollen. Flowers will utilize stripes to encourage a certain landing pattern of those animals, and symmetry of the flower to make sure there's only one way to come in at that nectar and therefore get the pollen on them. Fascinating, really cool area of research. Let's check out this video.
Many plants rely on animals to transport pollen from the anthers to the stigma of the carpel. Typically, the pollinators are rewarded for this work with a sugary substance called nectar, or with pollen that is high in protein. Many different animals act as pollinators, including bees, beetles, butterflies, birds, and bats. This video shows how a bumblebee visiting a salvia plant will burrow its head among the flower's petals to suck the nectar from the flower's nectary. The anthers of the flower are located in such a way that the bee inevitably becomes dusted with pollen. When the bee emerges from the flower, it spends a few seconds using a specialized set of bristles on its first pair of legs to brush the pollen from its body and maneuver the pollen into the yellow pollen baskets located on its third pair of legs. The bee is not completely successful in removing all the pollen from its body, so when the bee enters the next flower, it will deposit pollen on the sticky stigma of the carpel. For the flower, the bee is essential for its sexual reproduction to occur. For the bee, the flower provides a supply of sugar and pollen to manufacture honey for the hive. Credit courtesy of Graham R. Kent and Rebecca L. Turner Smith College.
So that's your flower coevolution or flower symbiotic relationship, that mutualistic. Everybody benefits, the plant benefits, the animal benefits. Yay! I mentioned this before, but for completeness sake, let's make sure we say this for fruit as well. It is beneficial for the fruit. It is beneficial to the animal to have fruit that is nutrient rich so that it can consume it and get the calories that it needs to survive. It is beneficial for the plant if the seed can survive the eating or the hiding, because plenty of animals will just hide seeds for a long winter, the fruit with the seed inside of it, that the seed will survive digestion or survive hiding and be able to be grown out. In this diagram, I've got the fruit ripening from flower that got pollinated all the way through a nutrient-rich, ready to go and presentable tomato to the animal that went and consumed it, swallowed the seeds, but then pooped out the seeds. Nice, dark, nutrient-rich, moist environment right next to the ground, ready for the seed to grow during the next good burst of solid temperatures that are good for growth. All right. Pause your video here to tackle these two questions, explaining defining features of angiosperms, including general structure and function of the flower and fruit, and discuss some of those evolutionary changes and advantages that our fruits, our seeds with fruits and flowers have over just a pure naked seed and cone scenario from the gymnosperms. 3, 2, 1. All right, hopefully you paused. Moving on from the next two. Let's look at diversity. By far, the vast majority of plants on planet Earth during our time living here on Earth are angiosperms. 90% of plant species on Earth are angiosperms, meaning they have a flower of some sort, whether it's flashy or not, and they produce fruit of some sort, whether it's fleshy and flashy. to attract an eater or not. As long as they make a flower and fruit, then they are an angiosperm. They are highly diverse because of all the different relationships they have with animals or with the wind or with the water in order to encourage that distribution of the pollen and or seed, and seed. And because they are so dominant all over the ecosystems, they have a lot of different niches they can grow into and adapt to as far as climates and soils and pollinator varieties available in those places. Within angiosperms, how are they divided up? The most common way we talk about them are two groups, our monocots and our dicots, or eudicots, true dicots. I don't really care whether you say monocot dicot or whether you say monocot eudicot. Eudicot is the better word for it, but clearly when I made this slide, I included both of them. So they definitely are recognized, both recognized throughout the system. Their name comes from the initial leaves that come out are called cotyledons, the seed leaves. And if they come out with one or two, mono, one, di, two cotyledons. We will broadly categorize them in angiosperms along these two categories. We do have variety beyond just our monocot and eudicots. There are a few other ones. I'm going to introduce them to you, but I'm not really going to hold you accountable to any of those. I want you to see that they're there, learn a few things. I'm going to hold you accountable for the difference between our monocots and eudicots going forward from this slide, or from this lecture. We do have these basal angiosperms. It's a very small lineage of angiosperms. Many of them are adapted to water and have some pretty cool adaptations that we're not going to get into beyond that. We did see the water lily fruit lotus earlier in lab. Star anise is in this category, which is a spice we do cook with, so culinarily very important, but not a plant we're used to seeing in our ecosystems anyway. Then we have the magnolids, magnolias. We do use these often in landscaping, so you may be familiar with these very stiff leaves of or petals of the flower. Their leaves, their petals, same. They are a interesting orientation of the way they are grown in a spiral pattern rather than a whorl. Not something we're going to get into on that difference between a spiral and a whorl, but a unique thing that if you get deeper into botany, you will probably dive into those differences. Genetically, they are beyond just that spiraling pattern. They are unique. So they have their own category. Our monocots. This is about a quarter of the angiosperms. And largest groups of them and some of the most diverse groups exist as orchids. I think it is the largest plant group are the orchids, the most diversity. Not largest in numbers found on Earth, but in diversity are these orchids. And then we have all the grasses. The cereal grains are in this category of grasses and are obviously very, thinking of the word cereal grain, very, very important crops. And most homes want a grass that is not a cereal crop, but it's still a grass as part of a vision of a home, to have that lawn in the front and back of a house, that lush green space for the children and the animals to roam and play. So, incredibly important agriculturally, incredibly important landscaping wise. Again, I've brought up landscaping before. It seems trivial, but it is billions of dollars of economic investment within the landscaping industry. Eudicots. There are way more of them than monocots, at least on the diversity scale. Largest of them, and also very agriculturally important, is the legume family. Our peas and beans, not just green beans, but all of the beans that we use for in culinary purposes. Black bean, kidney bean, black-eyed peas, any of those kinds of things. Let's see. Most of our flowering plants are eudicots. Not all. Plenty are monocots. But a lot of our flowering plants that we're used to for ornamental reasons or for landscaping reasons are dicots. And many of our trees that you might not think of as flowering because either they have such a short period of flowering in the very small period of spring, or they just don't produce very visible flowers that you're used to thinking of. But that includes oaks, maple, walnut, willow, birch, the trees you will see walking around your neighborhoods here. All right, take a moment. Differentiate between the two primary endosperm groups, your monocots and dicots. Remember, that's the ones that we are going to focus on. And highlight any other significant clades or subgroups that contribute to overall diversity of flowering plants. Remember, that first one's the one I'm really going to hold you accountable to. And we will revisit monocots and dicots in the subsequent chapter, in the chapter on structure and function, and we will have a lot more to add to be able to differentiate between monocot and dicot. But we're going to hold off on that for now until we get to that chapter. Pause the video here and answer those questions. 3, 2, 1. All right, flower structures. You got to dive into this in lab. I usually like having lab as a hands-on experience after you see it in lecture, and I'm hoping everyone's been reading and watching those videos, so after lecture and reading and videos, you finally get hands-on with it. But there's still a good amount of benefit to seeing it beforehand, so you get a chance to play with and see these terms before you learn them formally as part of a lecture. Either have benefits, but don't worry about it if you were too confused by these during lab. Hopefully today's lecture on some of these parts will solidify the knowledge you got to go experientially have exposure to in lab before lecture. So, flower structure. So, specialized leaves with the intent of reproduction. Pulling in a pollinator or getting ready for wind pollination, and capturing or releasing, making and releasing the male gametophyte as pollen, and capturing the male gametophyte that is now pollen on the stigma to fertilize the egg in the ovary ovule, the ovules within the ovary. So what are our parts? So sepals, they are down at the bottom. They will cover up the developing flower before it is ready. They are often green and photosynthetic. Sometimes they turn colors to further entice the pollinators in, but often you will see them as green things, and when you go and eat a fruit, you might call it a vegetable, but it is probably actually a fruit. You will actually see these on the tips of the plants that you go eat. Apples, pears, tomatoes are always there. Anyways, petals, brightly colored, attract the pollinators with many different things besides color, spots, lines, UV indicators that actually only show up with UV light. The stamens. These are your microsporophylls. They are the spore-producing leaves, even though they don't look much like a leaf anymore. And that's this entire structure consisting of both an anther and a filament. The filament lifts the anther away, so when a pollinator comes in, the anther brushes against the pollinator and deposits pollen onto its body. Then we've got the carpel. It could be called a pistil as well. Again, I'm not going to differentiate between carpel and pistil. Feel free to look that up if it's bothering you. And this entire structure that we'll call carpel consists of the sticky stigma on top where the pollen will land, the style, which elevates that stigma up so that the pollen brought in by the wind or a pollinator will be able to capture the pollen nicely. And then the style will also guide the developing pollen tubes that are growing away from the pollen down and into the ovary here at the bottom that contains one or more ovules. In this case, we can see just in this view here 6 ovules, which can accept the pollen tube and the nuclei within that pollen tube to the female gametophyte inside that has your egg. Flower structure. So this is just a zoomed in image of our stamen. I remember stamen is male because you can see the word men in there. So your stamen is the male part, and the anther has the microsporangiums up top that are your pollen tubes that make the they're the microspores that over time become microgametophytes, which over time contain the sperm inside of them. I know these terms are annoying because they are time-related terms. You are used to this in English in ways that are not dealing with flowers, right? A human can be called an infant, a toddler, a child, an adolescent, a teenager, and a young adult, and an adult based on their stage of development. Same can be said for a lot of the things in plants. It's just we're dealing with words you're not used to. The microspore becomes, upon further development, the microgametophyte. The microgametophyte over time makes and contains sperm, which over time become a pollen grain that gets released from the anther on the wind or on a pollinator. Our female structure, the carpel, with its parts, the sticky stigma, the style, the ovary containing the ovules. Same time-related sequence here. These ovules started as a megasporangium. The sporangium that makes the megaspores. Those megaspores over time became megagametophytes. That's second generation. The megagametophyte over time will make and contain the egg. If that egg gets fertilized, the entire ovule will develop into the seed, with the outermost layer, the ovule, becoming the seed coat, the next layer in becoming the endosperm or nutrient source, and the next layer in being the embryo. So, flower anatomy, huge variety, shape, size, color, odor, including ones with an odor that smells like rotting things to attract pollinators that like to eat rotting things, like flies and things like that. Anything else really interesting here? Not really. The more weird the flower looks, the more highly specialized it's become. It might be because of different petal fusions and things like that. So it gets complicated and interesting. And we're not going to dive too deep into these things beyond the classic flower anatomy as seen here. I'll use a very obvious flower. I'm not going to get into highly specialized flowers. Fruit structure and seed dispersal. Remember, the whole goal of our fruit is to attract a pollinator so that it gets eaten, or the fruit has to be ready for wind or water dispersion. Fleshy or dry is a general categorization we can have. The fleshy ones are gonna be your animal encouraging fruits, and the dries are usually gonna be wind or water encouraging fruits. Nothing nutrient rich, so no real big reason. So nice fleshy ones. We saw a lot of these in class or in lab on Monday. Tomatoes, plums, we didn't see, but yeah. Grapes, soft fleshy fruits. Their ovary wall becomes nice, nutrient-rich, flavorful, and colorful. The dry fruits don't usually spend much time on color. They will stay brown because there's no reason to attract animals to come eat them. And they will stay dry and tough until the seed inside is ready to be released. Usually. There are types that don't like to release them and rely on other methods to get that seed out. But many of them will open up and release. Plenty of them are adapted for wind. They have parts of the fruit that develop into wings, much like the pine seeds did. But instead, in these like maple flyers you see here, it's actually not just the seed you see here. That wing is actually the fruit, not the seed. The fruit can be found on the inside. If you carefully peel apart the shell, the bottom part of that flyer, you can actually take the seed right out. And the seed doesn't have the wind adaptations, which is different than our naked seeds. And let's see what else. Coconuts, good for water. I talked to a good amount of you about that one in class, but definitely didn't get to everybody. There's air inside of a coconut along with the milk that's in there, the coconut water. And that helps it just float, because usually those palm trees grow on beaches, or within reach of waves on occasion anyway. Those coconuts get carried out on the tide, and they get brought up on another beach that is not as crowded, possibly, and they get buried in the sand. Just like when you stand on the sand with waves, you'll notice how your feet start sinking and getting buried in sand. Same thing can happen in coconuts. And if the water recedes enough, or it got washed up high enough onto the beach, then that coconut can grow and thrive in its new beach-landed location. There are some cool ones like you saw in lab that have burrs, meant to be carried by animals, not via their digestive tract, but unwittingly on their fur. All right, lots of different fruit types. You saw a lot of these in class. Let's go through some of these major names we see here. So let's look at our dries. Dries usually mean not animal encouraged seed distribution. They will open up and release their seeds. Dehiscent, indehiscent. What are those names? Dehiscent means while still on the plant, they can actually open up and release them. Your classics are the follicle, like the milkweed you saw in class, the legume, all of our beans and peas. They will open up on their axes to release those seeds. I had those split open so you could actually see the seeds on the inside. And capsules, I only had the picture of the okra there. Not going to worry about anything below that. Your dry indehiscent means they don't open on their own. They will not just open as part of the fruit development. They will require another method to get opened or to have the seed grow out of it. And these are your achenes, Caspella, I don't know how to say that, nuts, and your samaras, which are actually a kind of an achene. That's your maple flyers. Your fleshies, your animal encouraged ones, whether it's berry, even though not all berries look like the berries you're used to thinking of in terms of grocery store words, like the tomato is a berry, the banana is a berry. Hesperidiums, those are the segmented fleshy fruits like your oranges and grapefruits. Your drupes, which will have a large hard seed on the inside, so think cherry and peach. And palms, think pears and apples that have hard seeds in a little pockets on the inside of the fruit. Your multiples and your aggregates. So multiples, that is when a single flower has multiple carpels. So multiple carpels, each of them getting fertilized, and they produce a single fruit that is actually many different fruits altogether. And these can be a multiple of many different things. They can be a multiple of achenes. They can be a multiple of berries. They can be a multiple of drupes. Aggregates, same idea, except these are completely separate flowers. Many different flowers, all of which have their own carpels, that all of which can get pollinated and fertilized, developing and fusing into one larger fruit. Your classic example of this, like we had in lab, is the pineapple. Each one of those little like eyes on the pineapple was a separate flower.
When seeds are mature enough, the ovaries change their function and develop into seed-dispersing structures called fruits. There are many patterns of fruit development, depending on the number of carpels, ovaries, and flowers that form one fruit. Fruits can also be divided into the categories of dry fruits and fleshy fruits. In dry fruits, the ovary dries out at maturity. It may develop hooks that catch animal fur, as in this example. Or the ovary and other flower parts may form a wing or a parasol, or hairs to catch the wind. Sometimes the dry ovary builds tensions that, when released, will shoot the seeds into the air. In fleshy fruits, such as tomatoes and peaches, the outer tissues of the ovary thicken and become soft, sweet, and brightly colored. Fleshy fruits invite animal dispersal. The seeds are ingested, and if they escape digestion, they are excreted with fertilizer, hopefully in a choice location.
All right, angiosperm life cycle. You got to see this in class, study it, cover up all the terms, see if you can tell the story of an angiosperm. Let's do this together. Just like the last set of slides, you'll eventually see a narrative for this life cycle. I'm going to start at the dominant form here. So let's start with the sporophyte. Somewhere in this area, we have an adult sporophyte that when it is sexually mature will produce a flower. That flower has all the structures we've talked about before, including, most importantly, a carpel for pollen capture and egg fertilization, egg making and egg fertilization, and or the male stamens for pollen creation and release. We have been looking at perfect flowers, or a complete flower, meaning it has both the male and the female organs. Not all flowers are like this. Some flowers are not bisexual. They have a male or female flower. Sometimes it's a plant that has a male and female flower on the same individual, but in different flowers. Sometimes they have them completely on separate individuals, and one individual will only make the male flowers, and one individual will only make the female flowers. Depends on the species, how they've adapted through evolutionary time. In this example, we're going to continue following the lily, our complete flower that has both sexual reproduction organs, the stamen, pollen producing, and the carpel, egg producing, pollen capturing. Let's follow the anther. Anther has those microsporangia, which inside make the microspore, which over time develop into the male gametophyte or microgametophyte, which over time produce a sperm nuclei that will release the sporopollenin on the outside, becoming a pollen or pollen grain, and then get distributed by animal or wind to a female reproductive organ. Before we go there, let's go back to the flower here and let's follow the carpel. At the base of the carpel, we have the ovary. Inside the ovary are the ovules. The ovules contain the megasporangium. The megasporangium makes the megaspores. One will become the dominant megaspore, which will become the female megagametophyte. The female gametophyte or the megagametophyte. That will have an egg nuclei, and we're now ready with a mature ovary and ovule inside the ovary. Let's get back to pollination. That pollen grain will land on the top, produce a pollen tube, transferring the sperm or sperm nuclei down the pollen tube. It grows all the way down and into the ovule, and the sperm nuclei fuses with the egg nuclei, becoming a zygote, and fertilization has occurred. So pollination was up here, fertilization is down here. In angiosperms, they do have a thing called double fertilization, where the second sperm nuclei that gets sent down the pollen tube will actually fuse with one of the other nuclei within the female gametophyte. That other one, which will be oddly triploid, distinction I don't really want to get into, becomes what we call the endosperm, which will be the nutrient-rich material that the zygote, as it develops into an embryo, will be surrounded by. As the embryo grows and the endosperm expands to store more and more nutrients for that embryo and to feed it currently in its growth, the integument that is on the outside of every one of these ovules will thicken and get firm, becoming the seed coat. Just like the naked seeds, we have our three parts. Seed coat for protection. We have a nutrient source. We're going to call it endosperm for angiosperms, but whatever. It's a nutrient source. And the embryo in the center. Exact same structure of the seeds, even though we actually have a different name for the nutrient source. But same structure, same function, same purpose. That seed will potentially be inside of a fleshy or a dry fruit. It will get far from the parent plant via wind or animal distribution, and then that seed can germinate, sending out its young leaves, its two seed leaves we call cotyledons, and the root tip to expand down into the soil towards the source of gravity. Let's see if this video explains it different than me. I'm sure it uses some different words. Let's see if that rings more true with you, or at least reinforces, and you get to hear it from a slightly different angle. Oh, what happened?
Angiosperms are plants that reproduce by means of flowers. Flowers are showy, colorful structures made of modified leaves. A flower usually contains both male and female reproductive structures. A flower can have up to 4 types of modified leaves: petals, sepals, carpels, which consist of a stigma, style, and ovary, and stamens, which consist of an anther and filament. Ovules and megasporocytes are present inside the ovary. Let's review the sequential stages of the angiosperm life cycle. The process that occurs in the ovary, which initiates the development of female gametophytes, is the division of a megasporocyte by meiosis. Inside an ovule, the megasporocyte, 2N, undergoes meiosis to form 4 cells, but only one of these cells survives as the megaspore, N. The nucleus of the megaspore divides by mitosis 3 times, resulting in one large cell with 8 haploid nuclei. Membranes then grow between these nuclei to form a multicellular structure called the embryo sac, which is the female gametophyte. The large egg cell is located at one end of the embryo sac. A diploid cell within the anther divides by meiosis to form 4 microspores, N. Each microspore, N, divides once by mitosis to form 2 cells. A tough wall is formed around the outside, creating a pollen grain, which contains a male gametophyte. Pollen Pollen grains are transferred by wind, water, or an animal to a sticky stigma in a flower of the same plant or another individual of the same species. After a pollen grain lands on the stigma, it forms a pollen tube that elongates downward through the style into the ovary. 2 sperm nuclei, N, form inside the pollen tube. The pollen tube enters the ovary and releases the 2 sperm nuclei into the embryo sac. 1 sperm nucleus fertilizes the egg, forming a diploid zygote. The other sperm nucleus fuses with 2 nuclei in the center of the ovule to form a triploid 3N cell that will develop into a nutritive tissue called endosperm. This process is called double fertilization. The triploid cell divides rapidly by mitosis to form endosperm, a tissue rich in starch, lipids, and proteins. The zygote divides by mitosis to form a sporophyte embryo with a rudimentary root and 1 or 2 cotyledons, seed leaves. The integuments of the ovule become a tough seed coat with the embryo and endosperm inside. As the ovules develop into seeds, the ovary surrounding the ovules develops into the fruit, which will protect and help disperse the seeds. The fruit falls to the ground and seeds germinate. A seedling uses the food stored in the endosperm and cotyledons to grow until it can begin photosynthesis. The young plant grows into a mature sporophyte that produces flowers, and the cycle continues.
Let's check out this one too.
The function of flowering is to produce seeds and disperse them to locations where the young plants are likely to survive. At each step, there is an emphasis on protecting the offspring. This activity reviews some of the most important steps. Events in seed formation begin with pollination, in which wind or animals bring pollen to the flower. The growth of pollen tubes cause the flower to discard its colorful parts, petals and stamen. After pollen arrives, the bright petals are a hazard. They attract animals that might eat the delicate young fruit. We've enlarged the ovary and sliced it open. An ovary contains 1 or more ovules that will become seeds if they are fertilized. 1 ovule is shown here, with the front removed to reveal its parts. The ovule is attached to the ovary wall by a stalk that provides nutrients. Starting from a pollen grain at the stigma, which is not shown, a pollen tube grows down through the carpel to the ovule. It carries 2 sperm that enter the ovule. 1 sperm fuses with the egg cell to make a zygote, which is the first cell of the embryo. The other sperm fuses with the 2 nuclei in the central cell, making a triploid nucleus. The triploid cell will grow and divide to make a food-storing tissue, the endosperm.
Alright, and then seeds.
This ovule has been fertilized and will become a seed. Each of its cells contains 1 or more sets of chromosomes, but the number of sets of chromosomes differs among the parts of the ovule. Double fertilization converts the large central cell from diploid to triploid, while the egg becomes a diploid zygote. The surrounding integuments remain diploid as they were before fertilization. The embryo is a young plant that grows from the zygote, while the large central cell grows into food-storing endosperm. All this is enclosed within a protective seed coat that grows from the integuments around the ovule.
Taking food through its stalk, the developing seed expands its endosperm and embryo. When the embryo is mature and dormant, the integuments develop into a protective seed coat and detach from the ovary wall.
The main axis of the embryo has a root apex and a short stem that may have a few tiny leaves, not shown here, near the shoot apex. The cotyledons are part of the embryo. They're the first leaves. Monocots have 1 cotyledon. Eudicots have 2.
So, again, here's your script. I'm going to just quickly scroll through this, but please feel free to use this for studying and making sure you have the right terminology to associate with the life cycle diagram that was then reiterated in these videos. Those videos are in your slideshow, so feel free to be able to rewatch those for emphasis. All right, with your neighbors, describe the life cycle of angiosperms by detailing their pollen dispersal, Fertilization, don't worry so much about the double part. Ovule, embryo development, fruit formation, seed, and seed dispersal strategies. Pause here. 3, 2, 1. And picking back up. Highly recommend side-by-side comparisons between angiosperms and gymnosperms. Much of the terminology you need to know crossover between them. So by studying both of them side by side, you will be able to get these life cycles down pat. Try doing them without all the labels. Feel free to download those slides and cover up the labels and remake them so that there's no giveaway of labels. But I would definitely try first using the labels, just like I did as I narrated that slide. All right, again, looking at human and economic impacts. Human welfare definitely depends on our seed plants for food, fuel, wood products, medicine, definitely food. Our need for these means we need to carefully think about preservation. There have been plenty of times throughout history where a dominant food source has become at risk of completely dying out because of a new pathogen that can target that plant. Having a diversity of seeds and seeds stored back from older generations with and without genetic modifications is key for keeping a stable source of these plants that we rely on for everything that we put inside our bodies, that we use to get around and to live out of the elements. Like I mentioned before, massive amount of products come from angiosperms. Most of the food that we eat that is not animal-based comes from our 6 major crops: wheat, rice, corn, maize, potatoes, cassava, sweet potatoes. It's 90% of the 80% of the calories consumed by humans. And our livestock that we eat, the meat sources, if you are a meat eater, rely on the grain as well. Yes, we could eat them without eating the grains, but they cannot grow without eating the grains. At least not on the timeline that we are used to in modern times, raising our food stock using purely the grasses, which are still angiosperms, that grow at a natural rate within a field. It takes more time and produces less meat for each head in a given amount of time. Just so you can see, beyond our cereal grains, all the other products that we rely on, tea and coffee are angiosperm products. Chocolate is made from the seeds and fruits of the chocolate plant. So many of our spices are all made from some part of a angiosperm plant. Still highly used within the lumber industry are maple and oak, poplar are other very dominant wood products you will see in Menards, Lowe's, Home Depot aisles. And lots of compounds we use in medicines come from these angiosperms. We are entering an age of being able to make a lot of this synthetically, or once we know about it, we can get them to be made by bacteria using genetic techniques to force them to express the genes that were not actually found in them. But the original products often came from, and we don't know about what we don't know about unless we can go find and explore the products that are made within our plants here on Earth. They're also, on an ecological level, very important colonizers. We made a big deal out of how a lot of the other plants that we've studied so far are amazing at growing in harsh conditions. Moss on bare open spaces of just pure rock, not even any soil to be found. And gymnosperms being able to survive in super cold regions. There are plenty of angiosperms that can still survive in these very sparse locations as well. These very use a word other than sparse, but I can't come up with one. Austere locations. The two I put here as examples are coconuts, because they can just float around and develop on sandy, bare beaches where that sand would not support much other life. The coconut thrives in that environment. The fireweed is pretty resistant, pretty able to grow in barren areas. Some of the first to develop in areas where a volcano has coated the surface in lava, now rock. They are pretty good at growing in these cracks, and part of how they get there is what makes them so unique. The fireweed, is it lava or is it just fire? Probably just fire, probably not lava. I take that back on the lava part. But fire devastated regions. The seeds, the fruit that surrounds that seed has these very aerially adapted structures to capture the wind and float very long distances into these barren environments post-fire. Big threats to plant diversity. Plants will survive in geologic time, right? We've gone through many mass extinctions during life on Earth. You've seen many of them, but it is never pleasant to live through such a thing. These things happen on geologic time, not on human timescales, not on human lifetimes. So the devastation that can happen during a human lifetime is huge, despite the fact that eventually the planet will recover and adapt and new species will thrive. But we're talking about hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years of time. So habitat destruction definitely changing the plants that thrive in our current ecosystems. Different plants that make up ecosystems are no longer adapted to what's happening there. Plants that, for example, thrive well here in Minnesota because it was a more colder area, are now not doing as well in the warmer summers that we've had in the last X whatever number of decades. We see plant species doing better now that used to be good in Minnesota, now doing better in Canada. And plants that once thrived really well in Iowa that aren't doing well in Iowa or Oklahoma. They were good there, they're not good there now. They're actually decent in Minnesota now. So you're kind of seeing this upward latitude movement of plants as we see warming. Also plenty of areas where we have lots of diversity among our flowering plants, like the tropics, experience a lot of clearing as they make room for more farming and more human habitat in these places. If done sustainably, that's fine. Population needs space. Humans need space. Our economies are built on having more humans contributing to economy because that is how we measure growth. That's a whole nother topic of whether that's good or bad, but done on an unsustainable level where farming in an area can't be sustained for more than 5 years before the land is depleted is not a good use of wide clearing or logging, things like that. Lots of nuances to those arguments, and happy to dive into those with you at some point if you want to chat about them. The more we lose our forests, the more we also lose the ability to sequester carbon, as photosynthesis converts that carbon to oxygen, and then those plants live a long life, storing that carbon within their wood. The more we turn over those products and use up those products, the less carbon sequestration. A lot of farming plants are not, they sequester carbon, but then we use all of it as we humans convert it to CO2, or it gets decayed back into CO2 by other plants, and then you're at nothing again by winter. Forests are very different because they don't die off every year. Definitely a threat to us, our food systems, our food chains, our lumber products, our medicines, all of that is a concern on the short timeline that we live in rather than the geologic time frame that would be necessary for evolutionary adaptations to take place. Study for a moment these ecological and economic significance of your angiosperms using these two questions. 3, 2, 1. And this is our last slide. I actually just included it because I like it as a overall study tool. You can see kind of our difference, the 5 derived traits of seed plants, period. I like it as a just study tool. Lots of words, lots of putting things together, and the importance of our seed plants, whether we're talking gymnosperms or angiosperms. And that is all. All right, everybody. Good luck studying. Please make sure you do read the chapter and watch those videos. Start coming up with some study tools that you can use to be ready to know the second of 3 chapters that'll be on our next test. Next week, we'll pick up with plant structure and function, or you could think of it as anatomy and physiology of plants in botany. And that'll be our last chapter before you see your next test and practical. Good luck studying, everybody.